Hi folks, Matt Easton here. So I'm here with Tobias Capwell again, talking about Cinquedeas, which are a type of northern Italian civilian sidearm, aren't they? Where do you think they came from and what do you think they were?
The interesting thing about Cinquedea is that they sort of pop up fully formed with not a lot of obvious precursors or successors. They're this genre of edged weapon that kind of exists apparently on their own. But of course they do relate very closely to things that came before and after, but in slightly unusual ways. They arise in the High Renaissance, in the period when the Italians were enormously interested again in the art and culture of the ancient world. And we know that there were actual Bronze Age weapons and armor in Renaissance Italian armories and collections. And I suspect, and I suppose you'd need a lot more work to prove it if it was ever provable, but I really strongly suspect that the design of the Cinquedea is inspired by the typical design of certain Bronze Age swords, where you have a guard, sort of a crescent-shaped guard that holds and has and seated into it a very wide blade, a blade that's wide at the top and then sharply tapers. That's in its ancient form. That's a good blade profile for something that's made in a metal other than steel, where you don't have the hardness, you don't have the temper. You're making something out of soft iron or bronze. You need a structure to the blade that is strong and robust. You can't build a narrow rapier blade out of bronze. So that's, I think, ultimately their more ancient inspiration. And in the Renaissance, they are an ancient reference. They speak to the cultured humanist education of the wearer. And that this is a wearer who is educated in the art and culture of the classical world. But the other really important thing about the Cinquedea, perhaps the most important aspect and interesting aspect for me, is that they are really one of the first classes of highly decorated edged weapon in the Renaissance that are designed specifically and almost exclusively for civilian self-defense use. And when you get a weapon designed for civilian self-defense and civilian wear, they inevitably become as highly decorated as the wearer can afford. They become de facto jewelry objects. And so in this way, the Cinquedea is the immediate predecessor in sort of cultural terms of the rapier. These are kind of proto-rapiers, if we understand a rapier to be a sword designed specifically for civilian self-defense use. And if you start thinking about it that way, you start to find that methods of decoration, workshop, school features in certain aspects of Cinquedea also appear on early civilian swords of other types and early rapiers. So the same people who were making them, the same artistic traditions that were affecting them, apply both to Cinquedeas and then later to rapiers. And on one level, they're kind of weird. Are they short swords? Are they big daggers? Sometimes you're never really quite sure what to do with them, and sometimes modern curators and scholars just avoid them completely because we don't know what to call them. But some of them are clearly short swords, and others are just big daggers. But they're fascinating things, and they probably deserve a little more attention than they tend to get.
And I think it's also worth mentioning there's actually quite a lot of them in surviving in collections, and perhaps part of this is natural selection because they're often very well made. So artistically people have hung on to these things because they look of good quality and they're pretty to look at. But it seems like they certainly weren't uncommon weapons historically. There seems to have been a region or an area, a spread of northern Italy where for a certain period of time, in what we're talking about, the middle of the early 16th century, middle of the 16th
Late
century?
15th century.
Yeah.
I mean, you could probably trace them back to the second half of the 15th century,
Right.
but you wouldn't really expect to see anybody wearing them after about 1530 or something, and that's
Yeah.
probably getting quite late. It's actually really hard to find depictions of Cinquedea in art, where you kind of get a better sense of how they're worn and who's wearing them, and you know, and I've only actually so far found one really good artistic depiction of a Cinquedea being worn, and it's worn horizontally at the back, on the back of the belt, so you can draw it straight out.
Which to me screams self-defense weapon
Yeah.
rather than
Yeah.
showing off weapon.
And smaller Cinquedeas sometimes that almost blend into early parrying daggers used with early rapiers. You often get them worn horizontally on the front, and the usefulness of that is that they can be drawn equally well with both hands.
Yeah.
Draw them with the left hand if the sword's coming out, draw them with the right hand if it's just a knife fight situation. So they probably have a little bit more practicality than all of their ivory hilts and gilded decoration would lead you to think.
I think the datings that you mentioned are also interesting because if you're looking at them sort of phasing out by about 1530, that's when you're starting to get the rise of civilian side swords and proto-rapiers essentially coming in. You know, we've got what we would call true rapiers coming in the sort of 1550s, 1540s, and there's a period of what seems to be more common side sword carry or sword and buckler carry in the 1530s, the time of Marozzo and Manciolino, through the 1540s. So it does seem like they occupy that space of civilian sidearm. Maybe there was some type of legal, I mean someone would need to research into this, maybe Pierre Marco if you're watching this out there, but maybe there was some kind of legal implication to people could carry a large dagger, but for some reason it wasn't socially acceptable to carry a sword around in the street, but they could carry a large dagger, or much how Langsmessers and Basillards were ways of getting around legal implications in different countries. And it is, I think I'm right in saying that there are sword length ones. I mean, there are some really long ones as well, aren't there? There aren't any in this collection, but
there are some certainly ones that are as long as a medieval arming sword.
Yeah.
Certainly. And a couple of these are getting to be reasonably long, to the point when you can't really consider them daggers anymore. But.
And I mean, they are very clearly serious weapons. They're not showpieces, although some of these are very ornate, and I'll show some close-ups towards the end of this video. They are clearly robust, serious, slightly scary fighting weapons, self-defense weapons, and they're roughly equivalent to a Roman gladius or something like that in terms of size and scale.
Again, very overt kind of classical feel.
Yeah.
These wide, short-guarded, steeply tapered weapons, they just sort of scream ancient world to you in some kind of visceral way. The other thing about Cinquedeas, as sort of on the more artistic level too, is that unusually at this earlier date, the blades tend to be as much a decorative element as the guards. Usually, we're often used to, later rapiers in the 16th and 17th centuries, we're used to seeing very ornate guards with often totally undecorated blades for practical purposes. Whereas on a good Cinquedea, it's very unusual not to have decoration of some kind on the blade. And most of the good ones have quite a lot of acid-etched and fire-gilded decoration. And if you look at the blade and look at the hilt, the blade is often more impressive than the hilt. And some examples like this one, you actually have a very high-quality, original etched and gilt blade, but the hilt is fake. The hilt is 19th century. But the blade is of such quality that they've wanted to do something with it, and they've wanted to make it saleable again. And it's clear that Cinquedea, purely because of their their decorative elements became extremely desirable for 19th century collectors, to the point when the demand outstripped the availability of originals. And I have to admit that there's a couple of fake ones in the Wallace Collection case, or composite fake versus original parts. Still a very, very good group, including one that has its original hardened leather scabbard. It's a good group, but I think it's a group of weapons that could reward further research. And it would be certainly interesting to know more about the best ways to fight with them.
Yeah, as far as I'm aware, these weapons are never dealt with at all in any treaties that we're aware of. But having said that, we know basilards were incredibly common, and I only know of one treatise talking about the use of basilards, which is poetically a Swiss treatise talking about the use of the basilard, and the techniques, incidentally, are very similar to the German Langswasser techniques.
These are almost like Italian basilards.
Yeah.
I mean, the basilard also is one of these weapons where it's trying to push as far as it can go with a dagger becoming a sword, but not technically being a sword, and you're not sure. Sometimes we just say basilard because we don't know whether to say sword or dagger.
Yeah.
And I think in many ways this is the Italian equivalent to that same kind of situation.
Yeah, and probably the same cultural area that was fulfilled by the Langswasser in Germany and the so-called Bauernwehr in the sort of Low Countries. So, there we go, guys. A look at the Cinquedea, and I hope that was interesting. And I will now show some close-ups so you can see really how intricate some of these hilt constructions are. Cheers, Toby.
Okay.
Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and feel free to follow us on Facebook.